Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to have a look at mixing with EQ. Now this is probably one of the most important uses for an EQ. It's certainly what I use EQ most for. And really what we're talking about is when you start combining more than one sound together, of any kind really. So it can either be different drum sounds within a drum kit, or it can be a full drum kit with other instruments like bass guitar or piano or guitar or vocals, anything really. As soon as you put more than one sound together, then you need to start managing and controlling the levels of the different frequencies of those sounds in order to make them fit together. I like to think of the analogy of a jigsaw puzzle. If you think about trying to put two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together, there needs to be a gap in one of them where the other one sticks out so that they'll fit together. So to put that in audio terms, I'm going to use this electronic kick drum, 808 kick drum, as an example. If I start it playing back, and then we have a look on the spectral analyzer, you can very clearly see here that there's a quite big peak sticking out in the sub-bass region here. Now I've chosen this example for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's so clear just by looking at it that there's one particular band of frequencies that sticks out and the rest of it's fairly low. If you look along the side here, this is the volume of these sounds, and you can see most of it is actually down between -54 and -72. That's actually very low in volume. So most of this is really not that loud. But what is loud is this one particular peak here, and if we look down in the bottom left, that's around the 55 Hertz region. And that's well within the sub-bass region, and that's one of the other reasons I've chosen these particular sounds to focus on. Mainly because the sub-bass region is one of the biggest problem areas when it comes to mixing. There's a couple of reasons for that, without going too far into it, because we're going to look at loudness in the next chapter on dynamics. But put it simply, the human ear is sensitive to some frequencies more than others, and the sub-bass frequencies we're really not that sensitive to. We certainly can't hear them as well as we hear some of the mid-range frequencies up around 1 kilohertz. These are the sorts of frequencies we're particularly sensitive to. And on top of that, it depends on your monitoring system. If you don't have a subwoofer, then you need to have speakers that accurately reproduce those low frequencies. And to be honest, without a subwoofer, a lot of speakers don't accurately reproduce that sub-bass region, or at least they don't allow you to hear it that clearly. Ideally, you're better off having a subwoofer if you can, but this is why I really recommend using some kind of spectral analyzer. If you don't already have one in your DAW, then try and get one of the free ones, because even if you can't hear what's going on in this region, at least you'll be able to see it. And because of this very reason that we can't hear those frequencies so well, what often tends to happen is as you start to layer more and more sounds together, if there's a lot of energy going on down here and you're not even really aware that it's there, then you'll start to lose headroom. And on top of that, if you're using compression or limiting on the master channel, then they're going to have to process all that audio as well. Even though you can't really hear it, it's still there. And so even though our ears aren't that sensitive to it, the volume of it might still be very loud. See, what happens with sub-bass frequencies is you tend to feel them more than hear them. So even if you don't necessarily notice them that much on your home setup, if you take that track then to a club or play it through a big PA at a gig or something, then you'll very definitely notice them, because there'll be a subwoofer or a bunch of subwoofers set up specifically to amplify them. So it's really important to get a handle on sub-bass in particular. But the concepts do apply right the way throughout the frequency spectrum. So anytime you mix sounds together, you might find there are particular frequency bands that stick out. And really, the golden rule I like to think of is what you want to do is figure out what's good about each sound, what it is you like about that sound, and try and allow those particular characteristics to stand out for each sound separately. So to look at that in more detail, we're going to look at layering this 808 kick drum with an acoustic kick drum. So if I play the acoustic kick, now you can hear that it's a much brighter sound and it's got much more presence, and it's got more of an attack. Going back to the 808 kick, Really, there isn't a lot to this except for those low frequencies. Got a little bit of a ring to it, but generally people choose an 808 kick because they want that really big boomy bass sound. Now, with the acoustic kick, you'll notice that even though it sounds very bright, and it's actually got quite an attack to it, if you actually have a look on the spectral analyzer, make sure the track's selected so that we're seeing that track specifically and not mixed with anything else. Having a look in this region, the biggest peak in the kick is actually around the same region as the biggest peak on the 808, but because, as I mentioned before, our ears are more sensitive to these higher frequencies, it sounds a lot brighter and higher, and it's less easy to make out those lower frequencies. Now, because we want to pick the characteristics of each sound that we like the best, what we want from this acoustic kick is that brightness and that attack. We don't really need those sub-bass frequencies because we're already getting them from the 808. And really, when it comes to sub-bass, you really don't need more than one sound occupying that sub-bass region. Now, you might actually have a bass guitar that has a bit going on in that region too, but even there, as we're going to see in a moment, it might not necessarily be the sub-bass you need it to occupy. It might be more the bass frequencies, which is sort of over the 80 to 100 Hertz region. But first of all, let's layer the two kick drums together. And what I'm going to do is stick a high-pass filter on this acoustic kick to remove some of those low frequencies. Now, you could use a parametric or bell curve filter, and you could even use that technique of boosting and sweeping through till you find the frequency you want and then cutting. But in this case, as we can see the frequencies on the spectral analyzer, we know what they are, and we also know that we don't really need anything at all from this acoustic kick below that range. So really a high-pass filter is probably the best one. You could also use a shelving EQ, but it only cuts by 15 dB, so it's not that huge a cut. The high-pass filter is definitely going to be much cleaner in this situation. And if we play that acoustic kick, you can hear it now sounds a bit thinner on its own, but we've still got all that brightness, which is what we wanted from it. And as soon as we mix it with the 808 kick, we've got all that sub-bass back from the 808, so we didn't actually need it. And you can't really tell that it's lacking in this acoustic kick anymore. It doesn't sound lacking because it's not on its own. And this is another important point to be aware of as well. Something might sound great on its own, but as soon as you add it to a mix, it doesn't sound great anymore. And this is one of the reasons why. In order to fit things into the mix, you need to make them fit together. And this is one of the key ways of doing that. So to take it a step further, if we add a bass guitar into the mix, now this is a particularly low, deep bass guitar. You can see it's called dub bass, so that kind of straight away gives you the impression it's going to be a pretty low, boomy one. Now if I just trigger them just like that, you can hear from the start it's way too overbearing down in this region. And you can see just looking at it there that there is actually a lot of energy in that sub-bass region. But one of the things about a bass guitar, if you think back again to that first video on frequency and harmonics, a bass guitar has its fundamental frequencies down in the sub-bass region. So on the E string, the fundamental frequency of an E string is 41 Hertz, and the fundamental frequency for an A string is 55 Hertz. But the second harmonics of a bass guitar, which is basically double the fundamental frequencies, so 110 Hertz for the A string and 82 Hertz for the E string. Those second harmonics are every bit as important, possibly even more important than the fundamental frequencies of the A and the E strings in particular, because the fundamentals are so low, they fall into that sub-bass region, which means that they won't carry the melody so well because you can't hear it so well. Whereas the second harmonics will, and they'll still allow it to sound bassy. So let me demonstrate to show you what I'm talking about. If we now cut that with a high-pass filter, you can actually hear if we hover around somewhere around 100 Hertz, we might increase the Q so you've got a little bit of a resonant peak, but we don't need to. you can already hear that we've significantly cut out that sub-bass region. It hasn't taken away from that bass guitar because a lot of the character of it is in these upper harmonics. So we now still have this sound where it sounds very bassy. We've got our sub-bass coming from the 808. We've got the nice brightness of this kick drum here, and we can really hear with clarity those notes from that bass guitar. So just by cutting out the sub-bass frequencies a bit on the bass guitar and on the acoustic kick, we've managed to make them fit much more snugly with the 808 kick drum. And as I said, this principle can apply right the way throughout the frequency spectrum. I mean, we could get really carried away and actually put a low pass filter on the 808 kick because, as we saw, we only want those lower frequencies. But it's probably not going to make a lot of difference because there isn't an awful lot up here that's really going on that it's clashing with, because there isn't really much in that region on the 808 kick. So if I just solo it, you can hear it hasn't really changed the sound that much. It's just taken away a slight little bit of that clickiness, which isn't probably really needed. But either way, I'm probably not going to bother there, but the idea is there at least, in that if you've got other sounds where brightness is an issue, too many sounds occupying that region, hi-hats or cymbals is a good example of that. If you're trying to mix cymbals with maybe some other sound with a lot of high frequency content, then you might want to look at doing something like that. Probably though, in most cases when looking at higher frequency content, I wouldn't be so aggressive as to use a low pass filter. I might look at using a parametric EQ and just cutting by a small amount. Now we might see some of this in the following video when we look at some of the key frequencies to pay attention to when mixing. But really, this is the concept of mixing with EQ, and you can take this concept and apply it right the way across the frequency spectrum.